Good evening, everyone. I chose to do my report on ADHD, and why it is so important to me is because I myself suffer from it, as does my son, Bryce, who is 8. It wasn't until he was diagnosed that I noticed that I actually had it. Growing up, I was a straight A student, and nobody would have ever thought I would have had attention deficit disorder. So I used the ADHD website and a website from the disease control, which seemed to both be very beneficial. What ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. With that said, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it affects 11% of children typically. School-age children, which are children under the age of 12. But it also, which most people do not know, affects 35 to 65% of those amount of children into adulthood. Whereas women are often not diagnosed as children and aren't diagnosed until adulthood. There are many misconceptions and myths about ADHD. Some people don't believe it's a real disease. Some people think it's overdiagnosed. Some people think that the causes of ADHD are from environmental factors, which are all not true. In 1994, ADHD was changed from ADD to all ADHD. Whether or not it involved hyperactivity or not, they changed it to one solid diagnosis. There are 3 different types of ADHD. It's predominantly inattentiveness, which is mostly what I have. You have a hard time focusing, you have a hard time staying on task, you tend to start a million projects at once and never finish any of them. I never had the hyperactivity part, which is the second diagnosis, predominantly hyperactivity, which is a child or an adult that cannot sit still, is constantly fidgeting, constantly touching things. And then there is the combined diagnosis, of course. My son Bryce has that, definitely, without a doubt. He has a very hard time staying on task in certain things that don't interest him. He has a very hard time staying focused. He doesn't sit still well. He does very well with sports like football because he is constantly moving. The symptoms of ADHD can be, like anything, mild, moderate, or severe. When diagnosing ADHD, you're given a checklist typically from your pediatrician, which most children over the age of 3 are automatically required to fill that out anyway. Well, parents of the children. I know when I went to the pediatrician for all 3 of my children's 3-year checkups, we were given this to fill out, whether or not they had any signs, because unfortunately a lot of children do have these signs. And the checklist looks a little something like this. It's just a very simple, basic checklist. You know, things like, does your child not pay close attention to detail or make careless mistakes in schoolwork, work, or other activities, often fidgets with hands or feet, squirms in seat while sitting still is expected. Of course, all these things are very typical of a 3-year-old, without a doubt, most children anyway. But when you're filling that out, if you check off more than 6 of those boxes for a child under 12, it sets off a red flag for more testing, further testing. As an adult, you only have to meet 5 of those criteria, because adulthood, you tend to show the symptoms less. You tend to have already been able to deal with those symptoms a little better. There are many causes of ADHD, attention hyperactivity disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, my apologies, none of which are poor parenting, watching too much TV, eating too much sugar. Those are definitely all things that will exacerbate the symptoms of ADHD, but by in no way, shape, or form do they cause it. The number one cause of ADHD in most children, 58% of children actually, is genetic. It's passed down from your parents, which explains why I realized I had it after my child was diagnosed, which is true for a lot of adults actually. That there is some correlation between brain injury and ADHD, depending upon the type of brain injury that was caused, but it is a neurodevelopmental disorder of the brain. Which brings me to things that people believe or don't believe about ADHD that are not true, myths. Since 1777, there has been more than 10,000 publications on ADHD, and most of them are the reasons and the causes of the disease. Brain scans done on adults and children with ADHD and without, there are significant differences. The cortical thinning in the frontal regions of the brain are thinner. There is thinning in patients with ADHD. There is also a reduced gray matter in the parietal, temporal, and occipital cortices in these people, which would explain why a brain injury could also manifest as ADHD. Unfortunately, for people that suffer from ADHD, there are social, emotional, academic, and work functions that just are so hard to carry out the everyday. So yeah, myth number one, there's plenty of myths, but I chose to only elaborate on 3. Myth number 1 being that it is not a real disease. But obviously, with all of these studies done on all of these different people, we can see that it is truly a neurodevelopmental disorder. Number 2 that I found interesting is that it's way overdiagnosed, which some may definitely agree with, some may not. Not to say that there aren't health professionals out there that do just diagnose as in anything, but from 2003 to 2011, there is a 5% increase every year in the amount of cases. So people may think, yes, they're just diagnosing anybody that can't sit still or anybody that doesn't do well in school, but that's not the case, because in 2014, there was a study showed that 90% of people diagnosed were diagnosed by a pediatrician, a healthcare professional, a psychiatrist, a psychologist. It's not something that just, the school nurse or the teacher is saying, oh, your child can't sit still, they must have ADHD and they need to be medicated, which is the stigma behind ADHD. Is a lot of people think, oh, every other child has ADHD and everybody needs to be medicated. That's not the case, because in our case, we did not want to diagnose our son because we didn't want him to have a crutch in life and we didn't want him to medicate. But at the end of the day, we realized that that is what's best for our child. The third is that it's only a disorder of the childhood, which is not true whatsoever. 35% to 65% of childhood cases carry into adulthood cases. With that said, there are also very many of people around my age bracket that are now being diagnosed as adults, predominantly women, because for some reason, women aren't diagnosed as girls. There's this stigma that, ADHD is predominantly male and predominantly boys. And I think part of it is just, they're more hyperactive, but that doesn't show anything. Just because a girl does better in school, in my case, gets straight A's, seems to pay attention, doesn't necessarily mean that she's comprehending anything. I personally did not remember a thing I learned throughout my high school and middle school and elementary school careers. For whatever reason, I don't know, but my parents thought my younger brother had ADHD, which obviously now as adults we realize that he definitely did, but the school refused to diagnose him. So there are a lot of other issues that come with adulthood and ADHD compared to childhood. Not to say they're more important or anything like that, but especially adulthood and working, trying to run a business, trying to run an office, trying to stay on task, all of that becomes very difficult when you suffer from ADHD and you don't have the correct therapy or the correct medication or the correct know-how on how to deal with this. You may not be very organized, you may not be able to go through with your tasks that you're supposed to be doing, meeting deadlines. And all of this obviously is not good for a workplace career, because in the end, you're slacking on a lot of things and you may end up even losing your job over these things. ADHD affects, as I've said, way more women than anybody would ever imagine. I know when I had my children and the pediatrician looked at my medication chart and she said to me, you're on this medication, you're on this medication, I would have never guessed. And I said, that's because it has helped me deal with things in my life. Often ADHD in adults, predominantly women, can manifest itself as depression, overeating, anxiety, alcohol abuse. Any of those things are true, unfortunately. I know for myself, as soon as I came to the conclusion that I had ADHD and was able to get help, my life was just that much better. And unfortunately for me, my anxiety and my ADHD go hand in hand. So my symptoms, my attention deficit symptoms are exacerbated 100%. And then my anxiety goes through the roof. And then I have no patience and I have no drive and I have no commitment to finish or complete any task. And with women, it's also much harder to control, especially on medication, because there are so many other factors in medicating a woman with ADHD, such as estrogen levels. When your ADHD symptoms are exacerbated, your estrogen levels are lower, which, as we know, is most of the month for women. So that doesn't make it easy, and you have to make sure, you're on birth control, you may be on anxiety medication, some women take weight loss pills. All of this stuff is going to counteract or interact with your ADHD medicine. That leads us to the treatment of ADHD. There are many different treatment options, which most people don't know. I know for me, the stigma was always, well, he's got ADHD or ADD. In that time frame, he must be on Ritalin. And then Ritalin became so highly available and abused, as does any other drug, unfortunately. But that's not the only option. That is a stimulant. Not all children, not all adults need stimulants. The main reason why we didn't want to diagnose my 8-year-old with ADHD is because we have a very strong family history of abuse, narcotic abuse, and alcoholism. Then our pediatrician told us that actually a child that should be medicated as a child and isn't is a lot more likely to self-medicate, which is a perfect example of my younger brother, who was not diagnosed and not medicated as a child. He habitually smokes marijuana, which is very common, and that is now one of the diagnosis for medical marijuana, and why you're able to get your license is ADHD, because it does help you focus and it helps you stay on task, which helps keep your anxiety low. My son, he takes a non-stimulant, as does myself. He takes a blood pressure medication, actually, because it is a non-stimulant, which he doesn't need the stimulant right now. Maybe in the future he may, but the non-stimulant keeps him enough even keeled to sit still. We don't want anything that's going to make him become a zombie or not have emotions. He still throws his temper tantrums and still can't sit still in class certain days, but we want him to learn how to deal with that stuff rather than give him something that just completely controls it. I take a non-stimulant also, but my son's is actually, like I said, a blood pressure medication, because the number one side effect of this blood pressure medication is an anti-anxiety and a decrease in energy levels, which works out perfectly for a child with ADHD. There are also other things you can do besides medication. You don't have to medicate someone. There is an extensive amount of behavioral therapy you can go through. As a young child is diagnosed, obviously you want to do something before you medicate them. You always want to try something before medication. So there's behavioral therapy for the parents also, and then as the child gets older and is able to deal with it and able to realize these symptoms by themselves, they can go to behavioral therapy by themselves. But what it does is it teaches you how to stay focused, how to stay organized. Organization in a person with ADHD is, I would say, more than half the battle, because the more organized and more on task you can stay, the better off you are. So medication, behavioral therapy, and also keeping a very healthy, consistent lifestyle. You want to stay on schedule. You want to stay healthy. You want to stay active. The better you can eat, the more regularly you can eat. So you don't want to, like anything in life, quite frankly, but you don't want to have a bowl of Cocoa Puffs for breakfast and then not eat again till 5 o'clock. You don't want to overload the sugars, the carbs. You want to have a nice, healthy, balanced diet, which is huge for me, and it's also been huge in teaching my children this, because my son with ADHD, as do my other children, they do tend to get more hyper when they have more sugar or red dyes or more carbohydrates compared to a lean protein or a fruit and a vegetable. So just like anything, keeping a good diet and a healthy lifestyle, exercise, anything you can do to let that anxiety and that pressure of the everyday life that you feel out will help you in the long run. So in conclusion, what we learned today is ADHD is very widespread, sometimes more so than we even know. It's not just this, random disease or random disorder and fake disease that people may want to believe it is, because unfortunately a lot of people are very uneducated on the subject. It is a neurodevelopmental disease. It is not by any means caused by anything you're doing or your child's doing. They can't be eating too much sugar and having ADHD. Yes, is it going to make them hyper? Most likely, and it's going to make the symptoms worse, but it's not causing your child to have this disorder, or yourself for that matter. There is obviously extensive studies done in this field to show that a brain with ADHD and a brain without do show significant differences. There's no denying that. And then we learned about the treatment options and what different treatments there are and why they're so important. So I hope you guys all enjoyed my presentation, my speech on ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I know for myself it hits home in way more ways than one, and hopefully it'll help some other people out there too. Thank you.